Everyone thought Elena Voss had lost her mind when she announced she'd keep the crumbling windmill instead of tearing it down for scrap metal. Her neighbors called her wasteful. Her own family said she was throwing away money. But what she discovered hidden inside that ancient structure left the entire county speechless. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The September morning broke cold and clear over Ashford County, the kind of morning where frost clung to fence posts and breath hung visible in the air. Elena Voss stood in the bed of her weathered pickup truck, surveying the eastern edge of her property where the old Hartwell windmill had stood for longer than anyone could remember. The structure tilted slightly to the north, its wooden blades long since broken and scattered by decades of storms. The tower itself, built from hand-hewn timbers and iron fittings, rose 40 feet into the pale sky, a monument to engineering from another era, beautiful in its decay, but utterly useless. Elena had inherited the farm 3 years ago when her Aunt Margot passed, and with it came 200 acres of decent pasture land, a modest farmhouse with peeling paint, and this windmill, silent, broken, taking up space on what could have been prime grazing ground. She'd walked past it 1,000 times, each time thinking she should do something about it. The wood was old-growth cedar, the kind you couldn't buy anymore at any price. The iron hardware alone, gears, shafts, brackets, and bands, would fetch a decent price at the salvage yard in Coopersville. She'd done the math carefully, sitting at her kitchen table with a calculator and a cup of cold coffee. Between the timber and the metal, she could probably clear $4,000, maybe $5,000. Enough to fix the barn roof that leaked every time it rained. Enough to replace the ancient tractor that broke down more often than it ran. Enough to finally upgrade the irrigation system that barely functioned. She'd made her decision that morning over breakfast. The windmill had to come down. By noon, word had spread through Ashford the way news always did in small farming communities, through the feed store, the diner, the post office, the hair salon. Elena stopped at Brennan's Hardware to rent a chainsaw and some heavy cable, and before she'd even reached the counter, Joyce Brennan was shaking her head with a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. "You're really going through with it?" Joyce asked, leaning on the counter with her arms crossed. "That windmill's been standing since before your grandmother was born, Elena. It's part of this town's identity." "It's been standing and doing nothing," Elena replied evenly, keeping her voice steady. "I can use the materials. The land beneath it could support another dozen head of cattle. I need the income, Joyce." Joyce laughed, but there was no warmth in it. She called to the back room. "Hey, Phil. Elena Voss is gonna tear down the Hartwell windmill for parts." Footsteps echoed, and Phil Brennan emerged from the storage area, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression incredulous. "The Hartwell windmill? You're kidding." "I'm not kidding," Elena said firmly. "That thing's a landmark," Phil said, shaking his head slowly. "Hell, it's on half the postcards in the tourist shop. You're gonna catch hell from the Historical Society. Probably from the whole damn county." "I'll deal with that when it happens," Elena said, pulling out her wallet. "Right now, I need to rent your equipment." Joyce rang up the rental with pursed lips, and Elena could feel both their judgment radiating like heat. As she carried the chainsaw to her truck, she heard Phil mutter to his wife, "She's gonna regret this." Elena pretended not to hear. At the Copper Kettle Diner that evening, the jokes had already taken root and spread like wildfire. Elena walked in hoping for a quiet dinner, but the moment she stepped through the door, conversations dropped to whispers. Stella Martinez, who ran the place and knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves, brought Elena her usual coffee with a tight smile. "Heard you're going into demolition, Elena," Stella said, her voice carrying across the half-full restaurant. "The Hartwell windmill, of all things. That's been part of the county skyline for 140 years. 140 years of doing nothing productive," Elena said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Some things have value beyond function," said an older woman at a nearby booth, Dorothy Klein, a retired librarian and self-appointed guardian of local history. She turned in her seat to look directly at Elena. "That windmill represents our heritage. You tear it down, you're erasing a piece of Ashford's story. You're erasing what your own ancestors built. Elena met her eyes steadily. With respect, Mrs. Klein, heritage doesn't pay for a new barn roof. It doesn't feed cattle or fix broken equipment. It doesn't keep a farm running. Dorothy's expression hardened. Your Aunt Margot would be ashamed. She loved that windmill. She used to paint it every summer, remember? Watercolors from every angle. She understood its value. My Aunt Margot also died leaving me a property that's barely breaking even, Elena said, her voice low but firm. She understood sentiment. I understand survival. The diner fell into an uncomfortable silence. Elena could feel every pair of eyes on her. Even the cook had stopped moving in the kitchen. Dorothy Klein shook her head slowly, disappointment etched deep into her weathered face. Practical to a fault, Dorothy said finally. That's this generation's problem. No sense of history, no appreciation for what came before. Everything's about money. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the diner. Elena finished her coffee quickly, paid, and left without ordering food. Her appetite had disappeared. When she returned home, her brother David was waiting on her porch, arms crossed, his truck parked at an angle that suggested he'd arrived in a hurry. He'd driven over from his place 30 miles away, which meant he'd heard the news and wasn't happy about it. David had always been the golden child, the one who'd gone to college, gotten a good job in the city, escaped the farm life. He visited maybe 3 times a year and offered opinions far more often than help. Are you serious about this? He asked before Elena had even climbed out of her truck. David. Aunt Margot loved that windmill. She used to take us there when we were kids, remember? She'd tell us stories about how great-great-grandmother Hartwell built it with her own hands during the pioneer days. About how women weren't supposed to know engineering but she taught herself anyway. I remember, Elena said, walking past him to unlock the door. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or frustration she wasn't sure. I also remember Aunt Margot saying it was a money pit that needed constant maintenance she couldn't afford. That's not the point. David followed her inside, his voice rising. It's about family history. It's about respecting what we inherited. That windmill is part of our identity as a family. I am respecting it, Elena said, her patience thinning. She dropped her keys on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. I'm making practical use of valuable materials instead of letting them rot into the ground while I lose the farm. You're not going to lose the farm. You don't know that. You're not here, David. You're not the one struggling to make ends meet every month. You're not the one lying awake at night wondering if the bank is going to call about the loan payment. So ask for help. I can. I don't want your money, Elena cut him off. I want to make this work on my own terms. And that means making hard choices that people like you, people who left, don't have to understand or approve. David stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. The whole county thinks you're making a mistake. The whole county doesn't have to pay my bills. Fine. David turned toward the door. But don't expect me to support this. And don't expect Mom to either. She's already called me twice, crying about how you're destroying family legacy. Mom moved to Arizona 15 years ago, Elena said wearily. She doesn't get a vote. David left without another word, his truck kicking up dust as he sped down the long driveway. Elena watched through the window until his taillights disappeared, then slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. The stack of bills sat there, mocking her, overdue notices, final warnings, red stamps that screamed urgency. She was doing the right thing. She had to be. That night, Elena lay awake in the bedroom she'd slept in as a child during summer visits, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the oak tree outside danced in the moonlight. She thought about her Aunt Margot, about the stories of their family's history, about the windmill standing silent in the darkness beyond her window. But she also thought about the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the barn roof that wouldn't last another winter, the fence line that needed replacing before spring, the tractor that might die completely any day now. Sentiment was a luxury. She'd made her choice. She had to follow through. The following morning, Elena started early. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when she drove her truck across the pasture to the windmill's base, the grass crunching under her tires, still stiff with frost. Up close, the structure was more impressive than it appeared from a distance. The main support posts were massive, nearly 2 feet thick at the base, fitted together with mortise and tenon joints that had held for over a century without nails or screws. Iron bands wrapped the timber at stress points, and the whole thing was anchored into a foundation of limestone blocks, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. Elena circled the structure slowly, examining it with a contractor's eye, planning her approach. The blades would come off first, what was left of them. Then she'd work her way down, dismantling the platform, the gear assembly, finally the main tower itself. It would take weeks of careful work. She'd have to do it safely, methodically. One wrong move and the whole thing could come down on top of her. She was setting up her equipment, measuring angles, and checking her safety harness, when she heard vehicles approaching across the field. 3 trucks pulled up, and several people climbed out, neighbors, all of them. Patricia Thornton, who owned the adjacent property. Ed Miller and his wife Carmen. Even old Dorothy Klein from the diner, though how she'd gotten out here Elena couldn't imagine. "Morning, Elena," Patricia called out, walking over with her arms crossed. "Heard you were starting today." Elena straightened, immediately wary. "That's right. We wanted to see it for ourselves," Ed said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Can't believe you're actually going through with this." "It's my property, my decision," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite the defensive anger rising in her chest. "Nobody's saying it isn't," Patricia replied carefully. "We're just saying it's a damn shame. That windmill's been part of this landscape longer than any of us have been alive. It's in every photograph of Ashford County. It's the first thing you see when you come over Brennan's Ridge." Dorothy Klein stepped forward, her voice measured but firm, carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I've been researching the Hartwell windmill at the county archives. It was built in 1883 by Iris Hartwell, one of the first women engineers in this entire region. She designed it herself after her husband died, taught herself the mathematics and the mechanics. It's one of only 2 original women-designed windmills left in the entire state. The Historical Society was planning to apply for landmark status next month. Then they should have done it while my aunt was alive and could have used the grant money that comes with it," Elena said, her voice harder than she intended. "I can't afford to maintain a museum piece that generates 0 income. So you'll destroy it instead," Dorothy said quietly, and the disappointment in her voice cut deeper than any shout could have. The group stood in uncomfortable silence. Elena could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Then Carmen Miller spoke up, her voice gentle but sad. "Elena, honey, I understand you're in a difficult position. We all know farming isn't easy. But this feels wrong. It feels like you're cutting down something that can never be replaced." "I'm cutting down wood and metal that I can sell to keep my farm running," Elena said. "That's all this is." "That's all you think it is," Dorothy said. "But you're wrong. And you'll realize that when it's too late." They left slowly, reluctantly, their disappointment hanging in the air like morning mist that wouldn't burn off. Elena watched them drive away, then turned back to the windmill. Her hands were shaking again, and this time she knew it was anger mixed with doubt. She pushed the doubt down and picked up her tools. Over the next 5 days, as Elena began the careful work of dismantling the upper structure, the mockery and ostracism grew sharper and more personal. Teenagers drove past her property at night, shouting insults, "Windmill killer," and "heritage destroyer." Someone spray-painted shame in bright red letters across her mailbox. Another night, someone threw eggs at her truck. At church on Sunday, families who had known her Aunt Margot for decades turned away when Elena entered, their silence more cutting than any words. She sat alone in a back pew, feeling every whisper, every glance, every judgment. Her brother David stopped answering her calls entirely. Her mother called once, crying, begging her to reconsider, then hung up when Elena refused. Even Sarah Martinez at the diner, usually warm and welcoming to everyone, served Elena with cool efficiency and nothing more, no small talk, no friendly smile, just food and a check placed face down on the table. The few friends Elena had in town made excuses when she suggested meeting for coffee or dinner. "I'm busy. Maybe another time. I'll call you." But the calls never came. The isolation was complete, absolute. She'd become a pariah in the only community she'd ever known. Marcus worked alone through those early autumn days, the accusations and disappointment pressing down on her like physical weight. Each morning she woke before dawn, ate a silent breakfast, and drove out to the windmill. Each evening she returned covered in sawdust and sweat, muscles aching, hands blistered, to an empty house and a silent phone. But she'd committed to this path, and Elena Voss wasn't a woman who turned back once her mind was made. Each evening, despite the exhaustion and loneliness, she looked at the progress she'd made, timber carefully stacked and tarped against rain, iron hardware sorted and cleaned and inventoried, and told herself she'd made the right choice. The practical choice. The only choice she could afford. What she didn't know, as she worked through those lonely days with the county's judgment following her like a shadow, was that the windmill held more than timber and iron. Hidden in its heart, untouched for over a century, sealed behind old wood and older secrets, lay something that would transform not just her understanding of the structure, but the fate of everyone who had condemned her. But that discovery still waited in the darkness, patient as stone, for the moment when Elena's chainsaw would cut deep enough to reveal what Iris Hartwell had truly built, and why. The work was harder than Elena had anticipated. The old cedar had weathered to an iron-like hardness, and even with a sharp chainsaw blade, cutting through the main support beams was slow, exhausting labor. Each cut sent vibrations up her arms, and by the end of each day, her shoulders burned with fatigue. But she worked methodically, safely, taking her time. The windmill had stood for 140 years. It deserved to come down with dignity, even if no one else in Ashford County thought so. By the end of the first week, she had dismantled what remained of the broken blades and removed the external platform that had once allowed access to the mechanism house at the top of the tower. The wood was in better condition than she'd expected. Some pieces were cracked and weathered beyond use, but others were solid, beautiful even, with grain patterns that spoke of trees that had grown slowly over centuries. She stacked these carefully, already imagining what they might fetch from furniture makers or craftsmen who valued such things. The mockery, meanwhile, had not subsided. If anything, it had intensified. On the second Monday, Elena drove into town for supplies and found a handmade poster taped to the window of Brennan's Hardware. It showed a crude drawing of the windmill with a red X through it and the words "Save Our Heritage" in bold letters. Below that, in smaller print, Elena Voss is destroying a 140-year-old landmark for profit. Tell her what you think. Joyce Brennan was behind the counter when Elena walked in. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Joyce looked away, her mouth set in a thin line. "I need 3 more chainsaw blades," Elena said quietly. "And another spool of cable." Joyce rang up the items without a word, her movements sharp and deliberate. When Elena reached for her credit card, Joyce finally spoke. "There's a town meeting Thursday night. About the windmill. Thought you should know." "What about it?" "The Historical Society is presenting their research. They want the county to intervene, maybe get an emergency injunction to stop the demolition." Joyce's voice was flat, delivering information without emotion. "Dorothy Klein's been working with a lawyer from the State Preservation Office." Elena's stomach tightened. "It's private property. Doesn't matter if it's deemed a historical landmark. Then there are restrictions." Joyce handed her the receipt. "You should probably come to the meeting." Elena took her supplies and left, her mind racing. An injunction. Legal action. She couldn't afford a court battle, couldn't afford a lawyer. If they tied this up in litigation, she'd lose months, maybe years. The bills wouldn't wait that long. That evening, she worked at the windmill until well after dark, her truck's headlights illuminating the structure. She needed to make more progress, needed to get enough material salvaged that even if they did stop her, she'd have something to show for it. the urgency made her careless. Her chainsaw blade caught on a hidden iron bolt, kicked back violently, and she nearly lost her grip. The blade stopped inches from her leg. She shut off the saw and sat down hard on the ground, hands shaking, heart pounding. The close call rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She was tired, working too many hours, letting the pressure get to her. She needed to be smarter about this. But she couldn't afford to be slow. On Thursday evening, Elena walked into the Ashford County Community Center for the town meeting. The room was packed, at least 100 people, maybe more. Every seat was taken, and people lined the walls. She recognized nearly everyone, neighbors, shopkeepers, farmers she'd known her entire life. All of them turned to look when she entered, and the murmur of conversation died. Elena found a spot against the back wall, standing alone, acutely aware of the space that opened around her as people shifted away. Dorothy Klein stood at the front of the room with a projector screen behind her, showing old photographs of the windmill, beautiful images from different eras, the structure standing proud against blue skies, surrounded by golden wheat fields, silhouetted at sunset. Dorothy spoke with passion about Iris Hartwell, the remarkable woman who had designed and built the windmill in 1883, who had defied every convention of her time. Iris Hartwell was widowed at 29, Dorothy said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Left alone with 3 children and a failing farm. Everyone expected her to sell and move back east. Instead, she taught herself engineering from books ordered from Boston. She designed this windmill to pump water from deep wells, to irrigate fields that everyone said were too dry to farm. And it worked. It made her farm thrive. It became a model that other farmers copied. She was a pioneer, a genius, and that windmill is her legacy. The room erupted in applause. Dorothy let it fade before continuing. And now her own descendant wants to tear it down for scrap money. Dorothy's eyes found Elena in the back. I filed a petition with the State Historical Preservation Office. We have documentation, photographs, even Iris Hartwell's original engineering drawings from the county archives. That windmill should be protected by law. More applause, louder this time. Patricia Thornton stood up. I'll contribute to a legal fund if we need one. This is worth fighting for. I will too, said Ed Miller. Hands went up across the room. Voices called out pledges, hundreds of dollars, thousands collectively. Elena felt heat rising in her face. She wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself, but her throat felt tight and the hostile energy in the room was overwhelming. These were her neighbors, her community, and they were united against her. Finally, she forced herself to speak. May I say something? The room fell silent. Dorothy nodded stiffly. You have the floor. Elena stepped forward slightly, though she didn't move from the back of the room. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I understand you all care about the windmill. I do too. But caring doesn't pay bills. That structure is on my land, and I'm barely keeping the farm afloat. The money from the materials will help me survive another year. Maybe 2. Then sell the farm, someone called out. If you can't afford to maintain it properly, sell to someone who can. The suggestion hit like a slap. Elena's face flushed. That farm is my family's legacy too. My aunt left it to me because she trusted me to keep it running. Your aunt trusted you to preserve what mattered, Dorothy said quietly. And you're betraying that trust. Elena had no answer. The judgment in the room was absolute. She left before the meeting ended, walking out into the cold October night, her chest tight with anger and shame and something that felt dangerously close to despair. The following days were the loneliest of Elena's life. The town's hostility had moved beyond passive judgment to active opposition. Someone filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming the demolition was unsafe and required special permits she didn't have. Building inspectors showed up at her property, examined her work, and left without saying whether she was in violation or not. The uncertainty was paralyzing. She called the county office repeatedly, trying to get answers, but was transferred from department to department, left on hold for hours, promised callbacks that never came. It felt deliberate, like the bureaucracy itself had turned against her. And then the weather changed. In the third week of October, the rains began. Not the gentle autumn showers that Ashford County usually experienced, but heavy, relentless downpours that turned fields to mud and roads to rivers. The first storm lasted 3 days. Then there was a brief pause, a single day of weak sunlight, before the next system rolled in. The old infrastructure of Ashford County, built decades ago and barely maintained, began to fail. The primary drainage canal that carried runoff from the agricultural lands to the river became clogged with debris. Water backed up, flooding fields. Livestock stood in water up to their knees. Crops that hadn't been harvested yet began to rot. Farmers tried desperately to dig new drainage channels, but the ground was saturated, and the rain kept coming. The water table rose. Wells that had been reliable for generations suddenly ran muddy, contaminated by surface runoff seeping down through the soil. The county's water treatment plant, old and underfunded, struggled to keep up with demand. By the fourth week, the situation had become critical. Children were being sent home from school with stomach illnesses. The hospital in Coopersville reported a surge in cases of gastrointestinal distress. The county health department issued warnings about water safety, but there were no good alternatives. Bottled water sold out immediately. People began driving to neighboring counties to fill containers, but that was expensive and impractical for farmers who needed hundreds of gallons a day for livestock. Elena's own farm was suffering. Her cattle stood in muddy fields, miserable and restless. The barn's leaking roof, which she'd planned to fix with money from the Windmill salvage, now poured water into the hay storage. Feed was getting ruined. Her losses were mounting daily. The Windmill demolition had stopped completely. She couldn't work in the rain, couldn't operate power tools safely in wet conditions. The structure stood half dismantled, a skeletal reminder of her controversial decision, visible to everyone who passed on the county road. At the Copper Kettle Diner, where Elena still occasionally stopped for coffee, more out of stubborn pride than welcome, the conversation was entirely about the water crisis. "My youngest has been sick for a week," Carmen Miller said, her voice tight with worry. "The doctor says it's from the water, but what am I supposed to do? We can't afford to buy bottled water for everything. The wells are contaminated," Patricia Thornton added. "Even my deep well is running cloudy. And the treatment plant can't keep up. They're asking people to boil water, but that doesn't help with livestock. This county's infrastructure is 50 years out of date," Ed Miller said angrily. "We've been paying taxes for decades, and where's that money gone? Not into maintaining what we need." Elena listened in silence, nursing her coffee. Her own situation was dire enough, but seeing the whole community suffering stirred something in her. These people had judged her harshly, ostracized her, fought against her decision about the Windmill. But they were still her neighbors, still the people she'd grown up with. The rain continued. November began with dark skies and colder temperatures. The flooding worsened. The county declared a state of emergency. The governor's office promised aid, but aid took time to process, time to arrive, and people needed clean water now. Elena spent her evenings alone in her farmhouse, listening to the rain drum on the roof, watching water drip into strategically placed buckets. She thought about the Windmill, about how close she'd come to salvaging enough material to fix her immediate problems. Now even that opportunity was gone, at least temporarily. The legal challenges were still pending. The community was still against her. She had never felt more alone, more defeated. It was on a particularly bleak evening, the rain falling in sheets outside her window, that Elena made a decision. She couldn't work on the demolition in this weather, but she could at least document what she'd found so far. She'd been so focused on the valuable timber and metal that she hadn't really examined the interior mechanism closely. The next morning, during a brief break in the rain, Elena drove out to the Windmill. She brought a lantern, a camera, and a notebook. The base of the structure was muddy, and she had to wade through standing water to reach the access panel she'd exposed during the demolition. Inside the Windmill's hollow core, the mechanism was more complex than she'd realized. Gears and shafts, yes, but also a series of chambers and pipes that seemed to serve no obvious purpose for a water-pumping windmill. Some of the chambers contained what looked like layers of sand and charcoal, materials that had somehow remained dry despite the structure's age and exposure. Elena studied the arrangement, frowning. This wasn't standard windmill construction. This looked almost like, but that didn't make sense. She took photographs, made sketches, measured dimensions. The design was intricate, purposeful. Iris Hartwell hadn't just built a windmill. She'd built something else, hidden within it, something the wind-driven mechanism powered. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she realized what she might be looking at. It couldn't be. That technology didn't exist in 1883, not in this form. But the evidence was right in front of her. She needed to be sure. She needed to test it. As rain began falling again, harder now, drumming on the wooden tower above her, Elena Voss understood that the windmill she'd been tearing down for parts might hold the answer to the crisis drowning her community. The structure everyone had fought to save wasn't just a historical landmark. It was a solution waiting to be discovered. And she was the only one who knew.